The steroid trials. The Vince McMahon maintains to be in the white whale of anybody who believes in the power of the state. How many times did Vince McMahon supposedly beat the government? This is the time when the government did the job in directly to Vince. Not like all these times where Vince kicks the government's ass kind of by accident, or he slid him a gigantic briefcase full of money, or what is it, a garbage bag, or why not just backed up the Brinks truck in front of everybody since it's such a well-known story that people were on the take. I mean, it's one of those things where people tend to believe they have their own version of events and that the government, with its infinite resources and time, which couldn't prove the case in court, well, me with my YouTube channel or my podcast, I would have cracked the case. Vince McMahon would have gone to prison if I'd have made the arguments. It's like, no, he wouldn't have. This case was dead in the water. It was stupid, but Dark Side of the Ring did a pretty good documentary on it. And what made it really good was that Jerry McDevitt was in it. So he was able to actually discuss how he was able to take down a lot of these charges that, people lobbied at Vince. And this is a great argument because it's not just Wade Keller or Dave Meltzer or John Arezzi or anybody else making proclamations, via, I was covering the event live. It is somebody who was legitimately sitting down thinking about this sort of thing, who was being paid to get knowledgeable about the subject, and then argue on behalf of the defense that what they said has taken place, you have no evidence of it taking place. So everybody knows this was Jerry McDevitt's one of his finest hours. The jobbing out of the American government to Vincent Kennedy McMahon. And you know what? That's what I would name the TV show. The jobbing out of the federal government to Vincent Kennedy McMahon. All right, so we got to talk about this episode of Dark Side of the Ring. As per the usual, I did some extra readings, but due to my schedule, it was very limited. Instead, I just thumbed through the book Sex Lies and Headlocks by Mike Moonningham and Sean Assail. I also found some of Hulk Hogan's testimony in the trial. Since Hulk Hogan was the star witness for the government, there are some important things in there that we need to know that were not necessarily lies, which a lot of people, Hulk Hogan lied. It's like, man, you can't prove that he lied. He lied on Arsenio Hall, but that's different from being a liar in court. It comes with two different types of consequences. Nobody cares if he lied on Arsenio Hall. Most people who go on Arsenio Hall lie. It's all about whether he perjured himself in court, which they cannot prove. And they could prove it, they would have went after him for it. So let's go through this thing. Who is our cast on this episode of Dark Side of the Ring? Our cast is the Warlord, who is going by his real name, but I think it's Polish and it's a nightmare to pronounce. Dave Meltzer, Phil Mushnick, Jim Ross, Jerry McDevitt, Wade Keller, John Arezzi, Brian Blair, and there's somebody else here, but I can't figure out who it was. All right, so we start with McDevitt and his bond with Vince McMahon. They talked about this at the beginning and at the end, that they have this unbreakable, unshakable bond due to primarily this case. That they've been through a lot together. He's been there for the Owen Hart stuff, the Chris Benoit stuff, but this case was, the most important because this case was before Benoit and Owen Hart and all that kind of stuff. So, I think that McDevitt has earned a very special place in the McMahon household. He's called intimidating by Wade Keller. He's intimidating and he's very tall. Like, Keller, shut the hell up. Meltzer, of course, puts over Hogan as being the biggest star in the business, which of course is appropriate. John Arezzi starts saying wrestling becomes very cartoonish with the size of these wrestlers. They're so big. Like 90% of the wrestlers are on steroids. The Warlord said that he knew Zahorian, and of course he did. At this point, Arezzi and Keller explained that who Dr. Zahorian was, and that Warlord said that Dr. Zahorian often came with a bag of steroids backstage at TV tapings. And B. Brian Blair says that, you know what? It was a high pressure to look your best. There was a lot of pressure to do this kind of stuff. So Jerry McDevitt explains that the steroids were the only drugs that were legal at the time for which the government gave you no guidance on dosage or side effects. So nobody knew what steroids could do to the body. They may have had some general idea, but they really didn't know. Again, there are many different types of steroids, by the way. And they are taken differently. There's orals, there's injectoids, or injectables, rather. And they have different effects on the body. And they'll give you different looks and different things like that. So that was one of McDevitt's main points, is that the government, for a long time, during most of the time these guys were doing steroids was legal. So we go through and we learn about William Dunn, or Bill Dunn, who was known who was a weightlifting coach. He gets busted with a bunch of steroids. He then flips on Zahorian. He wears a wire while he's talking to Zahorian. And Jerry McDevitt is, talking about the wire. And he says you can listen to the wire of Zahorian talking about steroids and how he sells steroids and all this kind of stuff. And he says that he didn't sound like a doctor. So the investigation into Zahorian finds its way to Stanford. Linda McMahon finds out about this and tells them to cut ties with Zahorian. It's not going to work out. Then B. Brian Blair says that he was met by the FBI, who wanted to talk to him about Zahorian, and they had FedEx receipts. This is something I learned in the book. They did go and check through Zahorian's FedEx records, and they was able to find out all these people he had sent steroids to, and that B. Brian Blair was threatened to be prosecuted. Oddly enough, I think this was the end of him being in this documentary. I don't think he added anything else to this joint. So there were 5 wrestlers that were set to testify against Zahorian. Piper and Hogan were 2 of those. There were some others, but we'll get to that in the part when I talk about the book. So McDevitt gets Hogan excused from testifying. And he said that he believed that the case against Dunn was strong enough to get a conviction, but didn't really want Hulk Hogan involved in this. And this, of course, where we get Mushnick and John Arezzi, who are, outraged that Hogan didn't have to testify in the case against Zahorian. And, McDevitt makes the argument that it was doctor-patient privilege, that Hogan had conversations with Zahorian in terms of being a doctor, in terms of, wanting to have children, and that he asked him for medical advice. And since Hogan had asked a doctor for medical advice, that made him technically his patient, ergo, doctor-patient privilege. And since a patient cannot be forced to testify against their doctor and vice versa, that Hogan was out of it. So Mushnick was infuriated. John Arezzi was infuriated. Why do these guys why does Hogan not have to testify? Mushnick was talking about how Hogan was on drugs and that he needs to, he managed to get out of it because it was going to damage his career. Which, again, is media spin. Like McDevitt just laid out how he got out of this. It had nothing to do with Hogan, protecting Hogan's career. They were asking Hogan about steroids on national TV around this time. It has nothing to do with his career, man. It had everything to do with McDevitt being smart, knowing that Hogan and Zahorian had some type of conversations, and said, maybe could be some doctor-patient privilege there. And, boom, there it is. And then nothing Hogan did was illegal. So the question is, what really could Hogan bring to the table other than, you know, did Zahorian sell steroids? You have more than enough evidence to prove that he did. You don't need Hulk Hogan. And that was McDevitt's point by saying there was enough evidence, with the wiretaps that Dunn provided and a lot of the other things that they were able to, the FedEx receipts and everything. There was more than enough evidence against Zahorian that you didn't need Hulk Hogan to testify at the trial. Ergo, McDevitt got Hogan to not have to testify. And the state was obviously okay with Hogan not testifying. And there it is. They still got a guilty verdict. Okay? So, they found that a lot of the wrestlers, as Zahorian was given drugs to, weren't patients and not people that he was writing prescriptions for. Therefore, he was just dealing drugs. And that sounds about right. So that's it. Then we start getting into that Zahorian's lawyer kind of flipped on Vince, and now everybody wants to go after Vince McMahon because now steroids are illegal. And, John Arezzi is talking about two men approaching his mom's house. And this is where we get a nice little banter here where we got McDevitt and Arezzi and then McDevitt and Mushnick, where McDevitt, after John Arezzi claimed two shadowy figures showed up at his mom's house and said that he lived in a dangerous neighborhood, McDevitt said nobody cares enough about John Arezzi to threaten him. which is hilarious. And it's so fucked up that he would say that about that guy. Then we get the great exchange between McDevitt and Mushnick, because McDevitt is talking about how Mushnick is he's writing hit pieces. He's the one calling for another investigation into Vince McMahon, and that the New York attorney's office is the one who picked it up. And Mushnick is saying, oh, well, McDevitt, this whole thing with him going after journalists. Notice how journalists become the victims. Like, they talk so much shit. And then as soon as you point out that the shit they're talking shit, they're like, oh, you're just picking on the journalists. Why are you picking on the journalists? Like, what are you talking about? You sitting here writing hit pieces like you're an expert in steroids or pro wrestling. And then somebody points out, like, what the fuck are you talking about? All of a sudden, oh, why you want to pick on the journalist? I'm just a journalist. It's like you trying to lead the march against somebody. In any event, Mushnick claims that I had no idea I had that kind of muscle when it comes to getting the feds involved with investigating McMahon. Now, here's the interesting thing, because he said that, right? That I didn't know I had that kind of muscle, that the federal government was paying attention to things that I write in a newspaper. But later in the documentary, McDevitt calls him essentially Vince McMahon or somebody called him a federal informant. And Mushnick says, well, they read what I wrote, so I guess I am. It's like, on one hand, you claim, I don't have that kind of muscle, that people are listening to me. But then you're like, well, they're reading my articles, so I guess I am a federal. It's like, wait a minute. You can't have both. You can't have both. Either you're just a lowly blue-collar journalist with no real connections and you're just writing how you feel and it's stumbling across the desk of some New York district attorney, or you're a high-powered journalist that works at a newspaper that pretty much everybody reads. It's the New York Post, if I remember correctly. I know it wasn't the New York Times. I'm pretty sure it was the New York Post, which is an old newspaper in New York. And in a situation that was pretty high profile, in that, it was a steroid trial with Zahorian, and he's calling for the investigation of Vince McMahon. I'm sure they did pay attention to that. I'm not saying that he had anything to do with it, but I think it would be, when you don't know who's reading what when you write it. Like, I don't know who's listening to the sound of my voice right now. I create something, I put it out there. I don't know who's going to hear it and who's not going to hear it. You know, so you can say Mushnick sat down and wrote how he felt or wrote what he knew about this whole ordeal, and it fell into the right hands and the right people read it. That doesn't make him a federal informant, but you can't be chuckling about that and then at the same time say, "Oh, I'm just a lowly journalist. Why are you going after me?" It's like, no, man, you're actively aiding in the destruction of somebody's life. Come on, man. So McDevitt talked about this being essentially a witch hunt, and that they felt like they were being stalked. And of course, there's no limit to how long the government can do this. There's no limit to how long they can investigate you, which means as soon as you retain an attorney, the bills start to pile up. Now, I hate to do this, but it should be done. In the previous Dark Side of the Ring, they talked about XPW and they talked about Rod Black, and he's talking about how Rod Black was fighting the government on the obscenity charges, the porn charges. And the government basically just ran out his income. They basically, investigated him for so long, drugged the case out for so long, he went broke. And that's what was happening here too. And which is almost always the case. That's why I say the government has infinite resources because it's taxpayer money. And they have infinite time because they can investigate you for years and years and years. They investigate guys like Al Capone for damn near 10 years, right? And they don't find anything for a decade. Who knows how many man hours that is wasted? Who knows how much money that is, taxpayer dollars that's wasted? And then they finally get them on something, anything. And they're like, yes, we got him. It was the guy is a multiple time murderer. You got him on tax evasion. I mean, I guess if you're looking for wins under a microscope, you found it, But compared to all the money wasted, no, that was not a win at all. And this wouldn't have been a win either because who cares about these guys doing steroids? They're doing their own thing. Anyway, Mushnick is talking about shadowy figures from Fairfax Partners following him around, investigating him. Hired by Vince McMahon, and that all these people, he started to make friends with them and had drinks with them. I don't know if I believe this. He's a bit of a scumbag, that Mushnick. They started talking about the limo driver, James Stewart, who was ready to testify. And then McDevitt said, well, this guy was a guy who hated Vince. He had perjured himself in a lawsuit deposition, and he basically wasn't trustworthy. Much like somebody else we're going to talk about that wasn't trustworthy because they tried to fire Vince. Vince fired him. So, of course, the steroid trial is making visible changes to the on-screen product. Hulk Hogan is winding down. Wade Keller is talking about, there becomes this shift to smaller wrestlers. And I was like, nope. Guess who was still there? Davey Boy Smith, the British Bulldog, and he was on steroids. And guess what else? Bret Hart, also on steroids. So, Shawn Michaels, also on steroids. Well, he got suspended for being on steroids. So, that shift to smaller wrestlers didn't change that much. Matter of fact, was the Bulldog there in 93? Because I remember he did go to WCW for a short time. I don't know. I think he was, though. I think Bulldog was there. He was definitely on steroids. And Bret Hart was definitely on steroids, too. There were some other guys that was there on steroids as well. Just because they moved away from Hogan and Warrior-sized guys, they didn't move away from guys on steroids, though. They just moved on to smaller guys who were on steroids. So, I don't know about that one. McDevitt started talking about, getting indicted. And he's like, this is good because we finally get a chance to prove that, this is all just nonsense. And we finally going to get our day in court. And John Arezzi is like, all right, this thing was a circus from the jump because Vince McMahon showed up with that damn neck brace on. Vince with the neck brace, I got to tell you, that's got to be top 3 Vince McMahon moments. Probably number 2. But I wouldn't be mad if it was number 1. Vince McMahon showing up to this trial every day of the week with his neck brace on. And John Arezzi says that it was a circus. Wade Keller talked about how the kids were scared, Stephanie and Shane. And Meltzer was like, oh, everybody's got Vince pegged as the baby face in this whole ordeal. It's like, because he is. And just because you don't like him doesn't mean he's not being harassed about something that they can't prove. So McDevitt explains the neck brace that Vince purposefully waited until he was on trial to get a neck surgery, and that the neck brace was real and wasn't just for sympathy. That feels like kayfabe to me. So the trial is about to take place, and McDevitt once again outsmarts the government because he's going to be representing the WWF, and Laura Brevitt is going to be Vince McMahon's personal attorney. So they did this because McDevitt had previously did the favor for Hulk Hogan in getting him out of the Zahorian trial. And they didn't want there to be a conflict of interest because Hogan was going to be a witness in this thing. So he willingly stepped down as Vince McMahon's personal attorney to represent the WWF. And then Laura Brevitt took over as Vince McMahon's personal attorney because he was being, he was going to go to jail if he, so he needed his own attorney. The Warlord then made it clear in this documentary that Vince McMahon never told him to use steroids, and that in fact he never bought steroids from the Zahorians because the price was too high. And McDevitt says, like, look, all these guys who came out here, all of them admitted to being on steroids, but all of them also admitted to doing steroids before they came to the WWF, which is the important part. Because everybody for years has believed Vince McMahon forced people to do steroids. But then you find out people were doing steroids in other places too, which would have been obvious to the average person if A, you watched anything other than WWF, and B, if you had a functioning fucking brain in your head. There are some times when you see a guy visibly change. Rey Mysterio is one of them, right? Rey Mysterio, when you look at him in WCW, and then you look at him in the WWE, you can tell that man got on the gas. Eddie Guerrero, you could tell he got on the gas. They visibly doubled in size, like they were Saiyans or something. They got 2 times as big. All right, they were on that HGH. But all these guys from the 80s, the Warriors, the Hogans, the Mr. Perfects, Rick Rude, all these guys, Piper, they were all doing steroids before they came to the WWF. All of them. And hell, the steroids is probably what got them hired in the first place. So that was a hilarious angle that nobody thought to play. And I remember superstar Billy Graham, who I think was one of the people who made public statements against Vince because he was mad at Vince at the time and was claiming that they made him take steroids too. Billy Graham was using steroids. Was he the champion in the 70s? In the early 70s, because he was a bodybuilder. So he was on steroids long before he even became a pro wrestler. Same thing for the Ultimate Warrior. He was a bodybuilder. He was on steroids. A lot of these guys who were bodybuilders or football players or guys with long-term injuries, they got on steroids for that reason. And nobody thought to think about that. Like, were you using steroids before this? Like, yes. So Vince obviously didn't pressure you to get on steroids if you were using steroids before you got there. I mean, come on. The Dynamite Kid, if I remember correctly, was on steroids before he got to the WWF. He probably got on them even more. Who else? The Junkyard Dog was on steroids before he got to the WWF. He was on steroids before he even got to Mid-South and became the Junkyard Dog. He was on steroids. Who else was on steroids before he got to the WWF? I think Ric Flair had done steroids before he came to WWF in 1992. Who else had done steroids that I can think of? That either admitted it, the Road Warriors, I'm pretty sure, were on steroids before he got to the WWF. And a lot of the guys in the NWA were on steroids too. Now, the difference was that Vince really hyped that look, whereas the NWA was perfectly okay with Flair being a little flabby and Dusty being fat and stuff like that. But you can't tell me some of those guys, especially a guy like Magnum TA, wasn't on steroids. You know, I'm sorry. It was the 80s. All those guys were doing coke and steroids. And if you want to be honest, a lot of people think that it was the steroids that killed your favorite wrestler and gave him a heart attack. It was probably the coke, if you want to be honest. They were pounding cocaine and painkillers. That's the stuff that probably killed them. There have been guys who have been doing steroids for 30 years, and they're not dead. Billy Graham is one of them. He's not dead. He's on steroids. That's not it. Now, HGH, that should have had your heart burst, for sure. Because it's human growth hormone. It'll make your heart big in your chest. That's how you get those. You could get like Triple H's hands. Like if you look at his hands when he was Hunter Hearst Helmsley, and then look at his hands when he's like, let's say 2006, Triple H's fingers are visibly bigger. The Rock's head visibly gets bigger because that's a HGH. Steroids will, you'll be ripped and everything, but that human growth hormone, I wouldn't fuck around with that. Edge was on that shit too. He was on it for his neck though. But tons of guys did steroids before they came to the WWE. And some of them did steroids when they got there because they felt like they had to. I can't tell you anybody that I looked at. Now I'm talking, back then. Obviously in modern day, before the Eddie Guerrero and the Chris Benoit stuff, guys like Rey Mysterio got on the roids immediately. And it felt like they had to get the push. But you had guys in the 80s, man. Just about everybody was on the gas. And I think everybody knew it. I lost my place. I went on a ramble and I lost my place. Okay, so here it was. Nails took the stand. Says that he had no personal animosity against Vince. Didn't know what the word animosity meant. Was asked if he hated Vince McMahon and said yes. Furthermore, McDevitt, ever thinking, said, hey, you made, Vince McMahon made you do steroids. And this guy is a star witness. He is the only wrestler who is willing to get on stand and say, Vince McMahon told me to do steroids. He is the only one. And then you see that Vince McMahon put him in an orange jumpsuit where you couldn't see his body. And I just like, that's government for you right there. They're too fucking stupid to know that not only that this guy had sued Vince McMahon before, right? They should have known that. That should have been something they should have been on top of. They should have known about the fight. If I remember correctly, yes, the fight happened in 92. And they were suing, Vince was in trial in 93, 94. So it was just a few months before this. If they had done their due diligence, they would have saw that Kevin Washholtz wrestled in an orange jumpsuit. You couldn't even see his body. What good would steroids do? Who knows? You could try to spin it though. You could say, well, they made him wear the orange bodysuit until he got on the steroids and got an appropriate body. Then they would have taken it off of him. That's a large leap in logic though. So, but he went up there and embarrassed the government as per the usual. Then McDevitt talks about Zahorian being essentially tortured and taken from prison to prison, 44 days in solitary confinement and all kind of other stuff. And he still didn't have any real idea of what they were talking about in conjunction of him working together with Vince to sell steroids. Then he was threatened with new charges for saying that he will sell steroids to kids. And this led to Zahorian taking a stand and, basically saying Vince was his partner and that he was selling steroids to wrestlers. Nobody argued this. Then we get the Emily Feinberg thing where we get the 60 Minutes call, where the husband of the lawyer, Bravetti, is calling wrestling journalists and other people pretending to be with 60 Minutes, trying to pump them for information, which the government is saying is witness tampering because he tried to, well, he did offer Emily Feinberg money, supposedly. Allegedly. You want to put it like that. I want to say allegedly. Now, a lot of people are really bought into this conspiracy theory too. I can see this actually happening though. Like, I can see somebody especially if maybe he had a different reason for doing it, because people know that these big things like this turn into books and movies and TV shows and stuff like that. So it could have been, I'm trying to get as much information as I can so I can write a book, or that we can pitch the TV show or something like that. But it also could be, hey, I just want to help Vince out. In any event, Meltzer and Phil Mushnick both claimed that they talked to this guy, and that his questioning of them led to Emily Feinberg being able to answer all of these questions very, very easily with, no real problems. And she's the personal secretary of Vince McMahon. McDevitt says that he actually liked Brevetti's husband, and that there was no witness tampering, and if there was, the government would have brought it up, that it was, all made up horseshit, which, is more likely the case. Especially when things, one of the things that I've learned is that when journalists make the story about them, you could tell it's largely made up. It's fantastical. Not saying that these things don't happen. Weird things happen, especially during big trials where people are trying to get as much information as they can because this is a big event, and, weird things are bound to happen. So I wouldn't put it past, also I wouldn't put it past Vince to do some witness tampering. I wouldn't put it past him to do that. So witness intimidation, some witness tampering, I can see that. But the fact that the government didn't even bring it up, and it's now a conspiracy theory spread among wrestling journalists and dudes online, and not something that was, brought up in the case, at least not to my knowledge. Just, it is what it is. So they brought up the inevitable. The first thing I thought of when I started looking into the case again, Zahorian was prosecuted and was a doctor in Pennsylvania. McMahon is arrested for held on trial for crimes in New York. How does that make sense? And therefore, McDevitt, is the lawyer, so he explains that they wanted to establish that they have standing, that they have venue, and they tried to do so through Emily Feinberg. That's why she's there, because she is the one who supposedly was sending the steroids from Titan Towers to Hulk Hogan or whoever else that wanted them, from Stanford to New York, from Stanford to Pennsylvania, from Stanford to whatever, right? So they're trying to use Emily Feinberg to prove that crimes actually took place in New York. That's why she's there. So she's there to prove that crimes occurred in New York. Of course, they failed to do so because they couldn't get the timetables to match. And this was the funniest thing to me, again, showing government ineptitude. That the government claims that an event took place, I believe it was October the 24th. I'm not looking at the paper. We'll get back to it when I talk about the book portion of this. But I believe it was October the 24th. They claimed that, the WWF is running Nassau Coliseum, and that Hulk Hogan got steroids from Vince McMahon at Nassau Coliseum. And then Jerry McDevitt, again, just being one step ahead of the government, says, what WWF show was at the Nassau Coliseum in October the 24th? And everybody was like, It turns out there was no WWF show October the 24th in the Nassau Coliseum in New York. Oh, God. It was October the 20th, not the 24th. So it was 4 days before anything supposedly had been sent to New York from Stanford. Oh God, man, come on, bro. Anyway, those charges were dropped. So then we get to Hogan. Hogan testifies, and Arezzi's like, "Oh, there was this big expectation that Hogan was going to bury Vince." And McDevitt is talking about how he felt sorry for Hogan because Hogan didn't want to be in this situation. He doesn't work for Vince anymore. And we get the audio clip of Hogan saying that Vince didn't do anything, that they shared what they had. They shared extras. McDevitt argues that there was really no evidence against Vince McMahon other than a single conversation that he had with Zahorian. They talked about the last words, I forget what they called, of Sean O'Shea, the district attorney, who cut a wrestling promo about how Vince is a corporate drug dealer and is the worst kind of human being. He's worse than Hitler and all this kind of stuff. And McDevitt is like, man, this stuff really damaged Stephanie because she's sitting here listening to this guy ramble on and on about how horrible her father is. And he kind of got a little teary-eyed. Might have been some crocodile tears, I don't know McDevitt that well. But he says that, he assured young Stephanie, who would have been, I want to say 18, 17, around this time. Maybe that's not even old enough. Maybe she might even been a little bit younger than that. That, he had something up his sleeve. So then McDevitt had become, a student of steroids around this time. So he learned about a drug named Anavar, which the FDA has said was unsafe for human consumption. And a lot of the wrestlers that had testified during this trial had taken Anavar. And he found that Anavar was never taken off the market. And that the government, knew that this was unsafe and allowed people to take it. So he was making the argument, I believe, that the government didn't care enough about the safety of wrestlers to fully regulate what people were taking, knowing that it was legal at the time, but it wasn't safe for people to be taken. And saying that, you guys who did all the research and did all this stuff didn't even do your due diligence and also don't let people know the side effects of the drugs that you sell. Well, not sell, but approve was more like the government thing. He argued that wrestlers being on steroids and all this kind of stuff is partially government failure. And that, a lot of this stuff has to do with the government. And, he said like for a second he didn't think about losing at all. And Wade Keller's like, oh, well, in the WWF, they're talking about this. They're trying to spin this as if the big bad government's coming after some family business. And it's like, it's literally a family business. It's literally the company that his father created, that he purchased from his dad. It's literally a family business. Now, you can argue that WWE today, when they try to pull that family business crap, like you've been publicly traded for almost 20 years. We can't keep doing the family business stuff. But as long as it's owned by, people get real tight ass. They think family business are supposed to be small. It's supposed to be some mom and pop shop that never leaves this core neighborhood. Bob's Pizza that's been on the corner for 15 years and there's never been another Bob's Pizza. And when Bob drops dead, Bob's Pizza is going to be gone forever. That's not really what a family business is. Family business means just that. It is an asset that is passed through the family. Walmart is a family business. Now, when people say Walmart is a small business, that's when you start, getting your eyebrows up, because Walmart's one of the biggest corporations in the history of the planet. WWE is not a small business, but it is a family business. It's still owned by the McMahons, and it's been owned by the McMahons since the 1950s. So, that part of it is true. And to them, the governments are the bad guys. Why wouldn't they be? They're trying to arrest Vince McMahon and throw him in prison. What other, that's not a spin. That's from their perspective, that's fact. From anybody's perspective, that's fact. The government is trying to arrest Vince McMahon and throw him in prison. That is exactly what is happening here. Whether it's for good or bad, it's up to interpretation. Whether you think Vince did it or not, it's up to interpretation. Even though I don't think how you can come to the interpretation that he did without providing some type of evidence, which, again, the government had ample opportunity to do so. They investigated him for 2 years. They found nothing. Vince beats the case. They're having a blast. And McDevitt talked about how there's very few acquittals in federal cases. Usually these cases, the defendants run out of money and they just settle and they sign a plea bargain, to avoid major jail time. And that there's like a 90% closure rate. And he also talked about, hey, it's very rare that people win. And it's very rare that people win without calling any witnesses. And he says a ballsy move on their part. They didn't call any witnesses. Vince didn't testify. He was asked why Vince didn't testify. And he's like, what does Vince have to add? Vince doesn't have anything to add. There was no evidence against him. In that case, I think Vince testifying in this trial wouldn't have done nothing but make Vince unlikable and turn the jury against him. Sometimes for that reason alone, even if you're in the right, you don't take the stand because it wouldn't take much. Vince McMahon has like a hair trigger temper, like you saw with the Bob Costas thing. They showed some clips in this documentary of him, speaking out about, Mushnick and all these other guys who've been talking bad about him. You've seen it on Donahue when he got snappy with Tom Cole and a lot of those other guys. If you put Vince McMahon in the witness stand, he gets asked the wrong question. And he's like, look at here, pal. And it's like, oh, God, this guy is a mob boss. Throw his ass in prison. Like, no way. I want to hear that. So, yeah, it was smart to not. It's always smart for you to talk as little as possible in trials. Unless you absolutely positively have to speak, it's best that you say nothing, And when talking, say as little as possible. And don't say nothing you're not going to remember. As somebody who's been sued, I'm telling you. Don't say as little as possible. In any event, already talked about the pop in the room when Vince beat the case, and Meltzer is flipping. He's kind of flipping out. He's like, so Vince didn't go to prison. Okay, Vince didn't go to prison, but all the guys are on steroids. What the government said was true. All the guys were on steroids. And it's like, yes, Meltzer, all the guys were on steroids. Guess what? Nobody gives a shit. This was a case about Vince McMahon conspiring with George Sahorian to sell steroids. That did not occur. Or at least you couldn't prove it. This was about Vince McMahon distributing steroids. That did not occur. Or they didn't prove it. It wasn't an argument of whether the Ultimate Warrior was on steroids. Sure, he was on steroids. He was also on steroids in Texas when he wrestled for Fritz Von Erich. He was on steroids in Memphis when he wrestled for Jerry Jarrett. He was on steroids. Rick Rude, when he was in Texas, he was on steroids. Now, all of that was before they came to the WWF. Them being on steroids was not the case. That was not the case. The case was Vince McMahon conspired with George Sahorian to sell steroids. That was the case. They could not prove that occurred. They could not prove that occurred. That's the problem here. You have these guys who were literally in the fucking room, and you still misinterpret what the case was about. How? How do you do that? It's a simple case. And Hulk Hogan, I think, says it, better. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and do that. Hogan, when he talked about steroids, he said we shared steroids like friends share cigarettes. And that's not distribution, right? I'm not going to get arrested for distributing illegal cigarettes if I open a pack of cigarettes and offer you one. That's not me distributing illegal cigarettes. right? That's me offering my friend a cigarette. So if I got pills, let's say it's aspirin, and you got a headache, and I go in my book bag and give you an aspirin, I'm not distributing fucking drugs unless it's illegal. If it was crack or something like that, then maybe. But steroids were supposedly legal at the time. Also, a lot of this stuff, people don't talk about this, but a lot of the stuff that they said occurred had occurred almost 5 years prior. They were talking about events from 1989 or 1988, 1989, in 1993 or 1994. So you're asking guys who get hit in the head with steel chairs, take pile drivers, and do steroids and cocaine and smoke a lot of weed too, probably. Hey, do you remember this thing that happened 4 years ago? It's like, fuck no, I don't remember that. There's no way I remember that shit. You know how many towns I've been in? I don't remember that shit. So, that was another big problem too, is if you take too long to investigate and bring the case in, people forget. They don't think about it. They did so many steroids and hung out in so many parties. They don't know. What time, what day, when did I see Zahorian? Fuck, I don't know. We went to Philadelphia every month for fucking 5 years. I don't know. I don't know which time I bought steroids from him. Fuck, I don't have no idea. Did you ever buy steroids from him? Yeah, sure, I guess. And that's just natural human stuff. You go through that if you ever been through like a lawsuit and they ask you about something that happened years prior or even months prior, or they ask you about things that are relatively insignificant. When was the last time you saw X? You're like, fuck, I don't know. I haven't legit don't have a clue. Most of the time it's a trick question anyway. They're trying to see if you will even answer it. Again, say as little as possible. Just say, I don't know. I don't remember. I don't recall. And usually that's enough. When you try to make a guess, it's for something they're going to try to, hang their hat on. In any event, McDevitt talks about Vince taking off the neck brace and swinging it in the air, which seems like a very Vince McMahon thing to do. But he assured us that Vince McMahon put the neck brace back on because he really needed it. Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure he really needed it. So this wasn't the most action-packed episode of Dark Side of the Ring. Mainly, you know how it ends. The journalists are deflated. Unbelievable. Vince McMahon beat the case. How could it have been possible? How could Vince McMahon have beat that case? Well, he beat the case by having good attorneys and because the government is, kind of stupid. They had infinite time and resources and still didn't build an appropriate case. Likely because there was no case there in the first place. But there is still some stuff to talk about. So let's move over to the book X Lies and Headlocks by Sean Assail and Mike Mooneyham. So let's start at the beginning. This is written in chronological order, so it's like broken up into spaces with also some conversation about, creative and that kind of stuff. Other financial things. So I went through and picked these things out and had to rewrite them in sort of essay format so that they make a little bit more sense as a chronological timeline. So Dr. George Zahorian III was a doctor of the Pennsylvania Athletic Commission as a part-time doctor. He became a house doctor for the WWF during the syndicated shows from Allentown. And part of his job was that he took vitals, which is blood pressure, temperature, that kind of stuff. And he also drew blood. In 1989, a weightlifting coach named William Dunn turned Fed witness and decided to wear a wire in a visit with Dr. Zahorian where he mentioned selling steroids to pro wrestlers. During this conversation, William Dunn paid $1,000 for 53 vials of steroids and painkillers. In 1990, he would go back to Zahorian where he spent $2,000 for 90 vials of steroids and 245 painkillers. In March 1990, The McMahons made Zahorian aware of the federal investigation upon him, supposedly from a payphone. Despite being warned, Zahorian sells $25,000 in steroids and painkillers to William Dunn. William Dunn then turned around and gave all of the things that he sold to the FBI. The FBI then raid Zahorian. They find receipts from Lord Alfred Hayes and Roddy Piper. A subpoena of Zahorian's records and his Federal Express account found regular shipments to Vince McMahon, Terry Bollea, Roddy Piper, and other WWF officials. The federal government subpoenas wrestlers on March 27, 1990, to indict Zahorian at 15 counts of distributing controlled substances, mainly steroids. Hulk Hogan was then removed from testifying by Jerry McDevitt, arguing that nothing illegal had been done on his part. June 24th, Zahorian's trial begins in Harrisburg. Piper testified, admitted to buying steroids. Zahorian defended himself by claiming he knew the wrestlers intimately, carried out physicals, and knew that no harm was going to be done to them. Despite the fact that he argued this, he was found guilty on 12 counts of selling controlled substances, i.e. steroids. In January of 1993, Sean O'Shea in the U.S. Attorney's Office of New York called a grand jury as he wanted wrestlers to testify as he was investigating Vince McMahon. The feds prosecuted Zahorian and shared info with O'Shea. So the prosecutor that prosecuted Zahorian shared information with O'Shea. And around this time, Vince McMahon also had the World Bodybuilding Federation. So Vince shuttered that as he was under investigation. But of course, we know that that was bleeding money. And that's part of the problem anyway. Around this time, Monday Night Raw also debuts. So Sean O'Shea wanted to prove that WWF talent were steroid abusers and they were defrauding the government on behalf of major suppliers such as toys, vitamins, and NBC. So he was really out to prove that the WWF was phony and that all of them were steroid abusers and that kind of stuff. That was his ultimate goal. So, which, seems to be the thing that Meltzer agrees about. In November of 1993, in Uniondale, Long Island, Vince McMahon entered the federal courthouse, charged with 3 counts of conspiring to distribute steroids to wrestlers in violation of the Food and Drug Administration. The chief evidence against Vince McMahon was delivering steroids to Hulk Hogan to the Nassau Coliseum on October 24th, 1990. The problem was WWF and Hulk Hogan were not present on October 24th, 1990. O'Shea built his entire case around Zahorian, Pat Patterson, Hulk Hogan, Emily Feinberg, who was Vince McMahon's secretary, and Anita Scales, who worked for Linda McMahon. Notice her name was not mentioned in Dark Side of the Ring. July 7th, 1994, Zahorian testified that he sold steroids in the locker room and to Vince McMahon personally. Was told the boys would return to the black market if he turned them down. Rick Rude, who admitted that he used steroids, testified that Vince McMahon was worried about his look after a show in the early 90s because Rude had gotten off steroids in order to impregnate his wife. He was asked if Vince McMahon directly told him to use steroids. He said no, but Vince said something to the effect of, when you're down and out, you have to learn how to push yourself. Kevin Washoltz, Nails, claims Vince McMahon told him to use steroids. Pat Patterson testified that he fired Zahorian on behalf of Linda McMahon. That the wrestlers often lined up in the locker room to have their vitals taken, not to buy or receive steroids. O'Shea brought out a memo from Linda in 1989, which stated that WWF wanted to cut ties with Zahorian due to the investigation. Pat also said it was his own idea to warn Zahorian about the federal investigation. Anita Scales said that a change to the Pennsylvania law no longer required athletic commission doctors to be at ringside. This is what led the WWF to cutting ties with Zahorian. And as Zahorian continuously contacted the WWF to keep his job, even using his position as, quote, Candyman in order to keep it. Pat Patterson wanted Zahorian rehired. Therefore, he was. This was under the order of Linda McMahon. Later on, Linda found out about the investigation and said that Zahorian was too hot and had the invitation to his return rescinded. This is a very important thing here. The change in the Pennsylvania law is not mentioned in no conversation that we ever have on this subject. That the state athletic commissions in Pennsylvania no longer required you to have a ringside doctor. Therefore, the WWF felt like they didn't need to have a ringside doctor anymore. Therefore, we don't need Zahorian anymore. So they got rid of him. But he was lobbying the company. You know, he was, I guess, you know, somebody that the boys really trusted. The boys really liked him. Obviously, he's giving them drugs. So they make the case to bring him back. And Pat Patterson's like, okay, let's bring him back. Linda's like, whatever Pat says, just do it. Therefore, Anita is going to hire Zahorian back. Then Linda finds out that Zahorian is under investigation. And she's like, nope, forget it. Whatever Pat said, forget about it. So that's where we are in this situation. So that made the WWF had the opportunity to argue that Zahorian was not a WWF employee, but a legal appointee of the Pennsylvania Athletic Commission. In other words, he never really worked there. Now, this is an argument that I don't know how well it stands up, because there is some argument that he was hired. Technically, he was hired back after the law was changed, but I don't think he ever made it to an actual show. That could be up to interpretation. So the Emily Feinberg, the situation which we discussed earlier, is that WWF attorneys or Bravetti's husband or fiance appeared as a tabloid talk show producer to, wanted to pay her for her story, but Feinberg never actually took any money, so nothing happened. She testified that Vince McMahon kept steroids in a mini fridge of his office, and that he often had limo drivers deliver the drugs to Hogan wherever Hogan appeared. They also, in the book, suggested that Feinberg might have been one of Vince's mistresses, that perhaps they were intimate, doing a little hibbity-dibbity. I wouldn't be surprised if Vince McMahon had a female attorney, a female secretary. Any event, under cross-examination by McDevitt, she couldn't recall any specifics nor whether she actually saw anything. So any specific times of drugs being delivered, she could not recall. Therefore, this is when McDevitt, dropped the bomb. At October 24th, there was no WWF show that had actually occurred 4 days prior. Terry Bollea admitted to using steroids as early as the 1970s. He considered, now around this time, Hulk Hogan had immunity, so he could say whatever he wanted. And he admitted to receiving steroids at Titan Towers about 10 times, and that he used Feinberg to place his road orders. On cross-examination, Hogan failed to remember if he had received steroids on the dates in question. The dates in question were April 13th and October 24th, 1989. Hogan admitted to receiving steroids from Vince McMahon and Emily Feinberg. Also claimed that they were just sharing steroids. Therefore, the judge dismissed the charges of distribution against Vince McMahon, which all remained was the conspiracy charge. Sean O'Shea, in his closing, regarded Vince McMahon as a corporate drug dealer. McDevitt argued that the federal government couldn't prove the case. All they had was a single conversation between Vince McMahon and Zahorian, and a picture between the three of him and Hulk Hogan. Zahorian destroyed none of his records, and Zahorian was not hired following the change of Pennsylvania law. This was enough to get him found not guilty. Vince McMahon beats the case. So this was a little bit more in-depth than what Dark Side of the Ring did. Obviously, there was so many people involved in this case. So many different wrestlers were involved. A lot of other ancillary characters from people who worked in Titan Towers, like limo drivers and secretaries and personal assistants and all sorts of stuff. Of course, the wives and girlfriends and everything too. So this video will probably be, forever, in trying to get it down to the nittiest of the gritty. But I think we learned just from reading, these passages from the book, these factoids from the book. And Mike Mooneyham, he has a certain way of writing, but I don't really see him as being a unnecessarily overly biased one way or the other kind of guy. I wouldn't say I trust his writing, but I trust it enough that he followed the case pretty well in doing. And I know that a lot of his information came from Dave Meltzer, so it is what it is. But the Hogan stuff, now I found a different site for the Hogan information. So we're gonna go through some of the Hogan highlights. So some of the things that are never talked about when it comes to Hulk Hogan's piece of testimony is that Hulk Hogan admitted from getting steroids from other doctors from 1985 to 1989. So Zahorian wasn't Hulk Hogan's only doctor. He had other doctors that he got steroids from. So that means that even if Vince McMahon was in cahoots with Zahorian, didn't necessarily mean that that's where Hogan got his steroids from. Interesting. Of course, he admitted to using steroids prior to the WWF. He used steroids in Japan and in the AWA. He claimed that 75 to 80% of the boys were on steroids. He told the court that Feinberg ordered his steroids for him, but he paid for them himself, and said that he and Vince often shared steroids. Steroids that they bought for personal use, and they would then share them between them. He also claimed to have prescriptions for all of his steroids, and said that Vince McMahon never directed him to take steroids. He also said that Titan never paid for steroids, and that the boys who bought steroids bought their own steroids, and that Titan had nothing to do with him getting steroids. And of course, like I said earlier, Hulk Hogan argued that he shared his steroids with his friends like smokers share a cigarette. So this is a very interesting situation because it's very realistic. Despite the fact that people think Hulk Hogan is the biggest liar that ever exists, mainly because Hulk Hogan is one of the biggest liars that ever exist, this doesn't sound too far-fetched. Everything that's there can probably be proven. They had a grand jury list, or I think it might have been a list from his testimony in the Zahorian trial, where he mentioned getting steroids from other doctors. And it was actually Vince McMahon's attorneys that brought this up, that he used other doctors, not just Zahorian. So it wasn't like, he only got his steroids from Zahorian. And he flatly says Vince McMahon never told him to do steroids, never made him do steroids, and it had nothing to do with him obtaining steroids. Hulk Hogan, of course, was one of the two that they believed to be the star witnesses. Well, one of the three. They believed Emily Feinberg was a star witness as well, because she was the one that was placing the orders. She was the one who was shipping the orders, and it was a belief that she was the one that was actually going to be able to prove that Vince and Zahorian were working together, but she couldn't, actually prove that point because she was just doing what she was told. She didn't know why she was doing what she was told, And if only thing she ever saw was Vince have steroids in the mini fridge, and they were Vince McMahon's personal steroids, which they probably were, especially if he's keeping them in his mini fridge, then what does she got to prove that, Vince is distributing steroids? If Vince uses steroids, which we know that he did, and probably continues to, maybe not in his old age today, but, he had personal use, Hogan had personal use, and then they were swapping. And they were, likely trading with each other and trading with their friends and all that kind of stuff too. So it's not really distribution. It's a wild case, but it's one that I don't see how the government even wasted everybody's money chasing this whole ordeal. Another thing I want to talk about just for a moment is that there's an incredible irony that the steroid trial, and I'm not saying that Vice did anything wrong here, but Vice is a network that is always talking about legalizing drugs, right? Vice is a one of those companies, one of those heavily left wing companies that is all about, you know, drugs should be legal and you should give people needles so they can do heroin in the street. But when it comes to steroids, people are like, "Oh no, you can't." It's like, what? If it came down to it, I'd take my chances with people who do steroids. I don't want to take my chances with people who, you know, who are shooting up heroin and nodding off in the street. I don't know if I want to take my chances with, you know, pill poppers and people who take psychedelic mushrooms and all that kind of stuff. I'm not so sure I want to do that. So I would have thought that Vice would have been a little bit more fair when it comes to, you know, the steroid thing. And it seemed like they were. You know, they was a little bit fairer when it comes to the steroid thing, more than they were in some other situations. You know, and I think mainly is because somebody from deep inside the WWE, being Jerry McDevitt, actually participated. In a lot of these other cases, like the Snuka thing and the Owen thing, there was almost nobody from deep within WWE that even wanted to be bothered with that shit. But since they won the steroid case, they're like, yeah, we'll talk about that all day. You know, we'll talk about that one all day because we won. But to be quite honest, even McDevitt's losses are wins. Like if we go back to the Owen Hart thing, it sounded like he lost that, but he didn't. He didn't. Vince didn't pay nearly as much as he should have. Like, so that guy is tremendous, man. And he should get a Warrior Award. Just for the steroid charge, though. I'm not so sure about the rest of the stuff he's involved in. But let me know what you guys think of this whole ordeal, man. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel, donate to the channel. Thank you guys for your time, man, and I'll talk to you guys later.